Welcome to the debate. Usually when we think about a private communication, there's this inherent expectation of a closed loop.
Right, yeah, like a fundamental assumption of privacy. Two actors operating in a completely closed system.
Exactly. You write a letter, you seal it in an envelope, and you trust that the only person who will read it is the one whose name is on the front. But then you step into the real world of international statecraft, and suddenly that closed loop is it's a total illusion.
Absolutely.
Today, we are looking at a historical landscape where the most consequential messages are often intercepted by a third party, usually operating in the shadows, entirely changing the calculus of world events. We're anchoring our discussion today in January 1917 and the infamous Zimmermann telegram.
It is truly a defining moment in modern history. We are talking about a highly secret, coded message sent by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to his ambassador in Mexico.
Right.
And the proposition in that telegram was just staggering. It was a military alliance against the United States. Germany explicitly promised that if America entered World War I, they would actively support Mexico in reclaiming Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Which is incredible to think about. And the crux of the story, and really what we're debating today, is the British intelligence response to this. Because British codebreakers intercepted and decrypted this message before it ever reached its destination.
Right, they caught it in transit.
Exactly. But they didn't just walk over and hand it to the Americans. They engineered this highly complex cover story to, carefully reveal it to the United States in a way that deliberately concealed how they had broken Germany's codes.
And that brings us to the central question before us.
Yes, the question is, was this British decision to intercept, decrypt, and carefully curate this intelligence a necessary, brilliant triumph of espionage and diplomacy? I'll be taking the stance that it absolutely was a masterclass in necessary intelligence sharing.
And I will be arguing the opposite. I look at this and ask, does it represent a problematic form of strategic manipulation? Did they effectively steer the American public into a global conflict on entirely British terms? Because to me, this event forces us to look at the intersection of cryptography and the actual manufacturing of public consent.
How so?
Well, I look at this event and I see the dawn of modern information warfare. Britain didn't just share intelligence, They weaponized it. They engaged in profound strategic deception, really leveraging the shock of the American public to engineer United States' entry into the war.
See, and I look at this as the ultimate justifiable intelligence triumph. They warned a neutral nation of an active existential threat to its own sovereignty, and they did it while brilliantly protecting the cryptographic advantage that was, frankly, absolutely essential to winning the war.
But at what cost to democratic transparency?
Well, to understand why this was a triumph, we have to actually explain how this happened. Because it wasn't just a matter of, someone reading a stolen letter on a train.
No, not at all. It was deeply technical and incredibly sensitive.
Exactly. You have to picture the reality of 1917 communications. There are no encrypted digital networks. Messages are sent via physical transatlantic cables lying on the ocean floor. And at the very beginning of the war, Britain physically cut Germany's transatlantic cables.
Which was a massive strategic move right off the bat.
Right. So to communicate with the Americas at all, Germany had to rely on alternative routes. And in this bizarre twist of diplomatic courtesy, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson actually allowed Germany to transmit messages using the United States' own diplomatic cables.
He thought it would facilitate peace negotiations, right?
Exactly, that was the hope.
Which is just a staggering irony. Germany uses the American diplomatic cable to send a message plotting the literal dismemberment of the United States.
It really is. But what the Americans and the Germans didn't know was that British naval intelligence, this highly secretive division known as Room 40, was secretly tapping those American cables.
So they're reading everything.
Everything. You have British cryptographers sitting in a dusty, silent London basement, agonizing over these columns of intercepted numbers, manually cracking Germany's highest level codes. And when they decrypt the Zimmermann telegram, they realize they are holding a geopolitical bomb. Germany is actively plotting to bring the war to the North American continent.
And the plot is undeniable. The hostility is real. I don't contest that.
So British intelligence faces this massive operational dilemma. They have to warn the United States. But if they just walk up to President Wilson and hand over the decrypted telegram, two disastrous things happen.
Right, the double bond.
Yes. First, they have to admit to Wilson, hey, we've been secretly tapping your private diplomatic cables, which would cause an absolute diplomatic meltdown. Second, Germany would immediately realize their top secret codes were cracked.
Right. They changed their cipher books overnight.
Exactly, blinding the Allies and potentially costing them the war. Therefore, the British had to invent a mechanism to deliver the truth without revealing their methods. And what they did was a masterclass in operational security.
They went to Mexico.
Right. They couldn't use the version they intercepted off the U.S. cable in Europe. So British intelligence chief Admiral Blinker Hall contacts an agent in Mexico. That agent literally bribes a clerk at the Commercial Telegraph Office in Mexico City to hand over the final physical copy of the telegram that was delivered there.
Just incredible spycraft.
It is. The British then hand that Mexican copy to the Americans, claiming, oh, our spies on the ground in Mexico intercepted this. They completely hid the existence of Room 40 and the tapping of the transatlantic cables. It was a perfect synthesis of cryptography and diplomacy. They neutralized the German threat without sacrificing the tools needed to defeat them.
Okay, you just laid out exactly what they did. And, it sounds like a brilliant spy novel. But you are completely glossing over the psychological and democratic cost of how they did it.
I don't see it as a cost. I see it as a necessity.
But the strategic deception wasn't just aimed at the Germans. By hiding the origins of the description, the British manipulated the context of the intelligence for the United States. When a nation receives intelligence from a foreign power, the provenance of that information, how it was gathered, who is delivering it, and what their underlying motives are, is just as crucial as the content itself.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because I think we have to separate the mechanism of delivery from the fundamental truth of the message. Let's reframe this with a more modern analogy.
Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine law enforcement secretly, and perhaps illegally, wiretaps the phone of a massive mob boss. On that wiretap, they hear undeniable proof that the mob boss is planning a hit on a rival.
Right.
If the cops just play the raw audio for the rival, the mob boss instantly knows his phone is tapped. He changes his communication network, totally blinding the police. So instead, the cops leak a transcript of the conversation and engineer a cover story, claiming they, overheard the mob boss talking at a crowded restaurant.
They hide the wiretap.
Yes. The cops are deceiving the rival about how they got the information to protect their wiretap, but they are absolutely not deceiving the rival about the reality of the hit. The British deception in Mexico City was strictly operational. The plot against Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona was entirely real.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the scale of self-interest and the actual target of the manipulation here? Because in your scenario, a police officer just wants to stop a crime. In 1917, the British Empire desperately wanted an American army in the trenches of Europe.
They were fighting for their survival.
Exactly. They were bleeding out, and they needed American blood to turn the tide. They weren't just a benevolent police officer handing over an anonymous tip. They were a deeply invested third party pulling the strings. You cannot divorce the mechanism of delivery from the political outcome they were trying to engineer.
But does Britain's motive change the fact that Germany wrote the telegram? Germany built the bomb. Britain just made sure the Americans saw it before it went off.
It doesn't change the fact of the telegram, no. But it changes the timeline, and it changes the psychological impact, which is everything in statecraft. Britain didn't just hand this over the moment they found it in January.
They waited for the right moment?
They sat on it. They waited for the perfect geopolitical moment. They waited until late February, right after Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare, when American public anxiety was already at a boiling point. The British knew that if they dropped this highly sanitized, carefully curated information into that specific powder keg, it would cause an explosion of public outrage.
But that outrage was justified.
They didn't just share a warning, though. They manufactured a psychological event.
Manufactured implies fabrication, like they made it up.
The outrage wasn't manufactured. It was the natural, logical reaction of a sovereign people discovering a foreign power was trying to give away their land.
The emotion was real, sure, but the context was curated. Think about the average American citizen in 1917. They sit down at their kitchen table, they open the morning newspaper, and they are hit with this staggering headline about a German-Mexican alliance.
Which again was a real proposal.
But that citizen feels a sudden surge of patriotic rage, believing they are reacting to an organic diplomatic crisis. They have no idea that their reaction was meticulously reverse-engineered by a cryptographer in a silent London basement. They don't know the information was deliberately leaked by a foreign government that desperately needs them to go to war.
You are placing an enormous, almost impossible burden of absolute transparency on an intelligence operation taking place during the most brutal war in human history. To argue that Britain somehow compromised American democracy by not attaching a footnote explaining their cable tapping operation, it seems to elevate an idealistic view of transparency way over the brutal reality of national survival.
It's not about a footnote. It is about the foundation of democratic consent. A democracy relies on its citizens and its leaders understanding the full context of the crises they face.
Even in wartime?
Especially in wartime, when statecraft and espionage operate entirely behind the headlines, the public is no longer making a fully informed choice. They are simply reacting to the stimuli provided by an unseen actor. The British proved that you don't necessarily need a larger army to win a strategic victory. You just need to control the flow of information. You need to be the one who decides what the public sees and when they see it.
Wait, but that completely ignores the agency of the United States government. You're painting a picture where the American public and the Wilson administration are just puppets dancing on British strings.
They were heavily manipulated.
But that isn't what happened mechanically. When Britain handed over the Mexican copy of the telegram, they didn't just say, hey, trust us. They handed over the encrypted ciphertext they bribed out of the Mexico City telegraph office, and they gave the Americans the keys to decode it themselves. The intelligence. The U.S. government decoded the Mexican commercial copy themselves. They confirmed it was real. Furthermore, Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, inexplicably admitted to the press that he sent it.
Which was a massive blunder on his part, yes?
Right. So the intelligence provided the spark, yes. But the American decision to declare war in April 1917 was based on a multitude of verified facts, including the sinking of American ships. The British facilitated the truth. They didn't invent the reality of German hostility.
They didn't invent the hostility, but they absolutely choreographed its debut. And that choreography is exactly what makes this a story of strategic manipulation. Let's look at the long-term legacy of this careful revelation.
Okay.
If the U.S. public knew the whole truth, that Britain was routinely intercepting global communications, that Britain was reading American diplomatic cables, the reaction might have been slightly more nuanced. The outrage at Germany might have been tempered by the uncomfortable realization that all the European powers were playing a massive, dirty intelligence game.
And you honestly think that realization would have made the American public shrug off the fact that Germany wanted to give Texas back to Mexico?
No, I don't think they'd shrug it off, but it would have disrupted the narrative. By stripping away all the messy context of Room 40 and the tapped cables, the British ensured the narrative presented to the American public remained purely good versus evil.
Which, in this specific instance, it kind of was.
But that is exactly the simplified, emotionally potent narrative you need to mobilize a deeply isolationist country for a foreign war. It is a chilling realization. It creates a paradigm where nations aren't just communicating with one another, they're constantly performing for the invisible eavesdropper who might weaponize their words at the perfect psychological moment.
But again, the moral failure here lies entirely with the author of those words. The Zimmermann telegram itself was an act of profound diplomatic treachery against a neutral nation. We are talking about a state of global total war.
True. In that environment, expecting total transparency and intelligence sharing is incredibly naive. The British navigated an impossible tactical imperative perfectly. They had an obligation to their own survival to keep their code-breaking secret, and they had a moral opportunity to warn the United States of an impending attack on its homeland. I agree they achieved their tactical goals.
They achieved both. It is difficult to look at the stakes of World War I and argue that the British should have prioritized the abstract concept of transparent diplomacy over stopping a literal German-Mexican alliance.
It is absolutely true that Germany authored their own destruction in this instance. The sheer strategic stupidity of the Zimmermann telegram cannot be overstated. But our debate is about the British response, and what the British response proved, unequivocally, is the staggering power of selective disclosure.
Selective but accurate.
But this event showed the world how easily a populace can be shocked into action by unseen hands operating in dimly lit rooms. It highlights how the democratic process can be bypassed, or at least heavily steered, by actors who prioritize strategic geopolitical goals over the messy, complicated truth.
Well, it seems we are arriving at the core tension of this historical moment. As we look at the whole picture, I maintain my stance that the interception and careful revelation of the Zimmermann telegram remains a gold standard of necessary espionage.
Even with the deception?
Yes, because the British were faced with a dual imperative. They had to warn a vital ally of an impending threat, and they had to protect the incredibly fragile cryptographic advantage of Room 40. By securing the commercial copy in Mexico City, they successfully navigated this tightrope. The deception involved was entirely operational, protecting sources and methods, rather than a deception of substance. The threat was real, the intelligence was accurate, and the resulting public shock was the natural consequence of Germany's own aggressive ambitions.
And I look at that exact same sequence of events and see the darker implications of statecraft. While the German plot was undeniably real, the execution by British intelligence reveals the manipulative power of controlling the timeline of truth.
The timeline, yes.
By carefully hiding the origins of the decryption, sitting on the intelligence until the optimal moment, and allowing the explosive content to dominate the headlines without context, they showed how a third party can weaponize information. It's a brilliant but deeply unsettling reminder that our most monumental historical shifts are often steered by careful curation, holding a mirror up to a populace at the exact moment you know it will provoke a catastrophic reaction.
It is a fascinating tension, and I think we both agree that it exists at the very heart of this story. There is a profound gap between the need for intelligence security in a time of total war and the ideal of democratic transparency.
Absolutely. The contrast between the public headlines screaming of betrayal in 1917 and the silent, behind-the-scenes realities of a few cryptographers breaking codes in Room 40, it fundamentally changed the course of history. It proved that the wars of the 20th century wouldn't just be fought with artillery in the trenches, but through the careful, psychological management of information.
Which brings us right back to that sealed envelope we started with. The Zimmermann telegram proved that once a message leaves your hands, it can become a weapon in someone else's. The complexities of World War I intelligence operations offer so much more to explore, leaving all of us to continually question where the line between vital intelligence sharing and strategic manipulation truly lies. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Until next time.